Hi, my name is Paul. I'm a grateful believer and follower of Jesus, who's delivered me from alcohol and severe depression. I was born and raised in a Christian home in the California Bay Area with my parents. With my parents and my younger brother. I can still remember my mom and we knelt down at my bedside when I was just 5 years old, and we said the sinner's prayer together, and I received Christ. I also remember beginning to struggle with insomnia when I was just 9 years old. I didn't realize that at the time, but that was the beginning of symptoms of depression and anxiety, which developed over time and then really exploded later in my life. And during my early adolescent years, I had the worst acne on my face of like all my peers. And so I developed a really low self-esteem, except for one area of my life, and that was running. When I was 12 years old, I became one of the best middle distance runners in the entire country. So at school, I was this loser, but on the track club, I was the star. Some aspects of running were fun, but a lot of it felt like pressure from my dad. I remember when my dad and I flew to New York for the Youth Track and Field National Championship, and I made it to the final of the 2-lap race, the 800 meter. Out of anxiety and fear, when the gun went off, I shot out to the lead. I was like way ahead of everybody for 1 3/4 laps. Then I had gone out too fast, and I totally ran out of gas in the home stretch, and 2 people passed me. As I crossed the finish line, I pounded the track in agony that I had gotten 3rd place, not 1st. And the first thing my dad said to me when he saw me after the race was, "You almost let 4th place get you." There wasn't much celebration of me accomplishing getting 3rd place in the country. It was just anger and regret for not winning. I continued competing and running at a top national level for the next 2 years, but then I began to get injured. I got some different injuries. But when I couldn't run, I just transferred all of that perfectionism and all that pressure to my academics. I was driven to get perfect grades in high school, to get into the most prestigious university. I remember when I got a B+ in physics, I was so enraged that I got B+ on A that I argued with the teacher about my grade, and when he wouldn't change the grade, I took my case to the school counselor and tried to press my case through him. So I was pretty obsessed, and I'm a perfectionist for sure. I struggle with that. Now at the same time, I was growing spiritually, and that was a good thing. I enjoyed the youth group at my church. My youth leader, he saw leadership potential in me, and he asked me to join his student leadership team. Together, we planned a mission trip to Mexico, which was really, really fulfilling, and I grew a lot closer to God through that experience. Also, I met my then girlfriend during that trip, who's now my wife of 25 years. Her name's Kristen. Kristen and I, we dated long distance all 4 years of college. I went to Yale, and she went to UC Santa Barbara. I'd never tried alcohol before, but I remember going to a party my freshman year and asking the host of the party to mix me a drink. He put together something really, really strong. Remember, he kind of smelled it, and he's like, "Whoa!" and he handed it to me. Before I even finished that first drink, I was experiencing a very heavy buzz. And it felt amazing. I remember the feeling just washed all the way down my body, all the way through my toes. For the next decade plus, I would try to chase hard after that original buzz, and nothing ever quite measured up to that very first drink in 1992. At Yale, I majored in biology. I was planning on going to medical school until I realized my senior year that I didn't want to be a doctor. So instead, I moved back to California. I married my high school sweetheart, and I taught math at a Christian high school. So I did that for 3 years. Just before our 1-year wedding anniversary, my dad died suddenly from a heart attack. It came out of the blue. We had no warning signs beforehand. Just one day he was out working in the yard, hit, and he died from a heart attack. It was a big shock to my family. My dad was well respected in the community and at our church, and so the turnout for his funeral was huge. I had felt like my relationship with him had been getting better, and so I was really, really disappointed by his sudden passing. I dealt with the pain of his loss by turning to alcohol more and more to numb that pain. Now, besides running and math, I've always been interested in music growing up. Growing up, I learned how to play the piano, the trumpet, the trombone, and then in college, I taught myself how to play guitar, and I sang in a couple singing groups. Kristen and I, we helped plant a church soon after we got married, and I began to volunteer on the worship team. I just loved doing that. Pretty soon at the Christian high school where I taught math, they also needed a worship leader. They had a weekly chapel time like we're having right here. They had that at the Christian school, and I started to lead worship in that weekly chapel time. And then pretty soon found myself putting together a youth praise band. And it became so popular with the students that I ended up taking this youth praise band on a tour of California. So we drove down the California coast, and we led worship at various schools and homeless shelters. And I'll never forget a key moment at the LA missions. It was the service for the men, and I'm here with these teenagers leading worship, and we did that for a while. Then I gave my testimony, and I invited the men to receive Christ, and quite a few came forward. And then we sang "Shout to the Lord." Anyone remember that song at all? "Shout to the Lord." It's huge, like 30 years ago, you know. We ended with "Shout to the Lord," and I just remember the response from the men was amazing, but what really, really affected me was looking over and seeing these teenagers leading worship and just tears streaming down their faces because the Spirit of the Lord was just so powerful, and God was using them, you know, as they were singing and playing their instruments in such a profound way. It was in that moment I pretty much decided, I think worship ministry is what God is calling me into. So I poured myself into volunteering in the worship ministry for the next year while I waited tables. So I left my teaching job to make more time and space to lead worship at my church. I was a singing waiter at a place called Max's Opera Cafe, which was kind of a funny time. But then after that year of volunteering a lot, my first worship pastor assignment was in Michigan. So my wife and I packed up our little townhouse and our 2 cats, and we moved from California to Michigan, where I served for 7 years. And we had our first 2 children while we lived there, Emily and Ryan. I have many fond memories of having little kids and helping another young church from that time, but I also have some very painful memories. My alcohol addiction had been slowly getting worse and worse over the years. I went from drinking very occasionally in college to almost every day by the time I was in my late 20s. Then my drinking kicked into a higher gear shortly after the birth of our first child. Alcohol became a way for me to cope with the pressures of ministry and parenthood. I typically have a glass of wine with dinner with my wife and my baby. And then she would take our daughter to the bedroom and nurse her. And while she was nursing her, I would drink several more glasses of wine. I got into the habit of filling the wine bottle in the kitchen refrigerator with more wine that I had stashed in the garage. I used a funnel in the garage to pour the wine in to the other wine bottle and make it look like I hadn't really drank that much. One day, Kristen found the funnel in the garage, and she looked at it. She's like, this looks funny. She sniffed it. This smells funny. And so she confronted me with that. And I told her I had been drinking a lot more wine than she had thought. I started to see a Christian counselor to get help with my drinking. And that worked for a while, but then I started to slip back into that familiar pattern of drinking and hiding it from everyone. I would lead my wife to believe that I was drinking O'Doul's, non-alcoholic, but in reality I had stashes of beer in other places, usually in my car, like the spare tire well of my car in the trunk, or in a compartment in our outside hot tub. So I remember going outside to the hot tub after Kristen would fall asleep and drinking just about every night in the hot tub. During the winter in Michigan, in the winter, it got so cold that the beers would freeze. So what I would do is I would let them float in the hot tub for a while until they would thaw out. Then I could drink. Just insanity. Now, even though worship ministry at this church was going pretty well, drinking really became my obsession. I began to find myself drinking at work, during the day, and drinking every night. Every Sunday, right after church, after people kind of left, I would go back to my office and I'd drink a few to start to get my buzz on. And once I did an experiment. I'm like, okay, I'm not going to drink for a whole week. Disgusted with myself, I put the remaining beers that I had at the bottom of our garbage can and then piled more garbage on top of that so Kristen couldn't see. I made it to day 4, and then I found myself digging through the garbage can and retrieving those beers. At that point, I'm like, I think maybe I have a little bit of problem here. I knew I needed more help, but at the same time, alcohol seemed to be the best way to cope. And I could hide it pretty well. That all changed on Valentine's Day 2005. I was grilling chicken outside in the snow. It was like cold, but I was grilling chicken outside to prepare our dinner. And I was doing my typical thing of drinking O'Doul's non-alcoholic beer inside in front of my wife, but drinking the real stuff outside by the grill. And as I finished the beer, I'd stuff the empty beer can into the snow, a little snowdrift that had accumulated on our deck. I'd stuff it in the snow. And I'll clean it up later, after she's fallen asleep or something. But then I believe God stirred up a mighty wind. Because what happened was one of these empty beer cans somehow got dislodged from the snow, blew out of the snow, rolled down one side of our deck. Then God changed the direction of the wind because it turned the corner, and then the empty beer can rolled down the other side of the deck, and it rolled and stopped right on the other side of a sliding glass door. And just on that other side, my wife was playing on the floor with our kids. She literally looked up and she saw a beer can just roll and stop right in front of her. She said, "Paul, is that your empty beer can?" For a moment, I hesitated. How can I spin this? How can I spin this? I fessed up. I said, "Yep, I've really been drinking a lot." The next day, I found myself walking into my first AA meeting, where for the very first time I said out loud that I was an alcoholic. I went to lots of meetings. I read the AA Big Book. I got a sponsor to begin working the steps, but I never made it past step 1 with him. However, I did find out that there was a program called Celebrate Recovery at a nearby church. And so I joined a step study there, and I finally worked the steps. That took about a year or so, but I worked the steps with a sponsor, with a Christian mentor in my life. I began this journey of healing and freedom from my compulsion to drink, but my much bigger recovery journeys were yet to come. So after serving as a worship pastor at that church in Michigan for 7 years, my family moved to the Oregon coast, where I was a worship pastor for 4 years. We had our third child, Amanda, while we were living there. Now, serving in ministry in a small town, it was a mixed blessing. I loved the beauty of the Oregon coast. I loved the slower pace of life. But it was also tough not to feel like I was living in a fishbowl. Everybody knew everyone else. And after 2.5 years of sobriety, I had a relapse with alcohol, followed by a new unhealthy pattern of going a few weeks without drinking, but then relapsing. Going a few weeks without drinking, and then relapsing. On one fateful weekend in 2010, it was the day before Easter. We had this huge Easter. We were like the mega church of the Oregon coast, large church for the Oregon coast. We had 3 Easter services. We were expecting 1,200 people. I got sick with a cold, and I completely lost my voice. And I stood up there and tried to lead worship on Easter. I couldn't sing. I had to have others kind of sing for me. I was so disappointed. In the aftermath of that, in the next 24 hours, I was still kind of sick. I was so disappointed that I didn't get to kind of shine for Easter. I was just feeling resentment towards God that my voice would be taken away for Easter. That I relapsed the next day. And then in the evening, my family wanted to watch a movie, so I volunteered to drive to the movie rental store. That's back in 2010. We'd still drive to the store to rent movies. And I get something for the family. On my way back, I got pulled over for speeding. And by a state patrol. And he said, "You're speeding. Also, have you been drinking?" I said, "No." I lied. So he got me out. He did a sobriety test. Then he cuffed me, and he brought me in. I had my breathalyzer test, and it read 0.08, right at the threshold. I received my first and only DUI. The next day, I met with the pastors of my church to tell them what happened, and they immediately put me on administrative leave. My senior pastor put together a 10-point restoration plan for me. I had some hope that I could work through this and then continue serving in a role that I love so much. And in the middle of the night, in some of the early days of that recovery journey, in the middle of the night, God woke me up. And he said, I think the only time I've heard God in an audible voice, he said to me, "Paul, I want you to be my son of light." I heard so clearly. And he also gave me a scripture verse, which has become my life verse, from Psalm 36, verse 9. "For with you is the fountain of life, and in your light we see light." What that meant to me was God was calling me into life lived in the light, where I would live my life without any more secrets. And also, it was kind of a double calling. The other part of being son of light is that he was going to use me to bring that light to others. Well, after working hard at that ministry restoration plan for 8 months, the pastors met with me again, and they asked me to leave. They asked me to step down permanently. I was so disappointed. I had tried to follow all of the steps so closely, but the pastors just felt like I was no longer a fit on their team. At that point, I thought that my ministry days were over forever. Just a couple months later, in early 2011, out of the blue, a pastor from Springfield, Oregon, gave me a call, and he said, I heard what happened. I heard what happened. And he said, I want to know if you and your family would be willing to move down here, come onto my staff, and just for a season, come here and heal, lead worship for our church, help me build a team of musicians, and we have a Celebrate Recovery here for you. Come, would you dare to try again? Would you come and use your gifts, even though you're broken? And we said yes. We moved to Springfield, Oregon. And we ended up spending 2 years there at that wonderful church. What a season of healing it was. Turned out to be the most healing experience of my life. I got to give my testimony at Celebrate Recovery that year. I even preached my first sermon that year for the church. I included my recovery testimony. It seemed like everything was working out great. After 2 years in Springfield, I found an incredible worship pastor position at a large church in the Seattle area. And so my family moved up here to this area in 2013. Things were really looking up. However, I still had big issues with anxiety and depression. And these issues had not been treated all these years. They've been building up. Furthermore, after a few more years of sobriety with alcohol, I began slipping into the pattern of occasional alcohol relapse, usually when my wife was out of town and I was feeling the pressures of ministry. And at the same time, my wife and I were trying to work through a very difficult issue in our marriage. It became more and more difficult for me to cope, and every time I would relapse with alcohol, I would just pile on more shame, and it was chipping away more and more at my mental health. Finally, early in 2015, I told Kristen about my occasional drinking because I kept it hidden from her. I hoped that this confession to her would get me on a better track, and January 2nd, 2015 is the last time I took a sip of alcohol. All right? But I was already spiraling down emotionally. I experienced my first major depressive episode in the spring of 2015. I began to have panic attacks regularly. After leading worship for Easter that year, I was so emotionally drained that I had my first all-out mental breakdown. It was so bad that a friend of mine took me to the hospital, where I stayed for about a week. I was having suicidal thoughts. Yet again, I had the strong feeling that my ministry days were over forever. It felt like, literally, my life was ending. The depression hung around. I got on some new meds and made some slow, incremental improvements, but the depression hung on heavy for another 4 months. And the church gave me a sabbatical for 3 months during that time to seek treatment and to heal. I'm forever grateful that they allowed me that chance to do that. I threw myself into recovery from depression. I tried everything I could to find some traction emotionally and spiritually. I met each week with a psychiatrist and a Christian talk therapist. I took medication. I read many books. I studied, memorized scripture. I attended depression recovery groups. I volunteered at the local food bank. I exercised regularly. I focused on good sleep hygiene and a healthy diet. I studied. I memorized scripture. Finally, when I got back into the swing of things with leading worship again, my depression melted away. For me, no other pain that I've ever experienced in my life, including the breaking of bones — I've broken my arm 3 times when I was a kid — doesn't even come close to the pain that I've experienced with severe depression. Also, for me, I would honestly say that, and again, this is just for me, my journey, that recovering from severe depression was about 10 times harder than the recovery from alcohol. During depression, my stomach is always in knots. I lose a bunch of weight. I have acute insomnia, accompanied with almost constant negative thoughts and worry. And for me, depression and anxiety go hand in hand like two sides of a coin. During severe depression, I also have frequent, very acute panic attacks where I believe that I am about to die. During a panic attack, time slows down for me to almost stand still, where every minute feels like an hour and every hour feels like a week. Well, God gave me a couple years of remission from that first major depressive episode. Grateful for that. But in 2018, a second episode hit. It was triggered by a pastoral care event where I was trying to help a friend who was suicidal. I had also weaned off my antidepressant meds, and that proved to be a mistake. I recovered from that depressive episode in a couple months. Then, in the summer of 2019, my worship pastor position at the church I had been at for 7 years, many people there who I loved, it ended abruptly and painfully. And I experienced my third major depressive episode late in that summer. Fortunately, I was able to find a new interim worship director position at an amazing small church a couple hours up north. And that encouraged me so much. And so that depressive episode only lasted a couple months. I also started to explore some new things. Like that's when I learned how to drive a school bus. And that's been a lot of fun. There's been some stress, but a lot of fun. I also I took classes to become a certified Christian life coach. And I started to volunteer for a local running sports ministry. And I also got a tip from one of my fellow bus drivers that there was this really cool Celebrate Recovery at a church in Puyallup. And I started to lead worship at that Celebrate Recovery. And so, and I began leading there in January of 2020. I started to lead worship there at that Celebrate Recovery. I just cherished that. It's so wonderful. I remember in the middle of February 2020, going to this great marriage conference with my wife in San Diego. It was amazing. And coming back from that conference and just thinking everything in my life is perfect. 2020 is amazing. What could possibly go wrong? Then COVID-19 hit. And basically everything that I enjoyed doing so much came to a screeching halt. School shut down, so I wasn't driving my school bus at all. Churches shut down, and Celebrate Recovery shut down, so I wasn't leading worship at all, at least not in person. And I just finished my life coach classes, so even that was done. In April of 2020, I went from having a very full and fulfilling schedule with lots of interaction with people to being isolated and all cooped up at home and having to homeschool my kids. And homeschooling for me was an epic disaster. All the shutdowns were also taking their toll on my kids' mental health. I wasn't getting along well with my children. And we're all cooped up there in the same house. Then the George Floyd incident happened. I became incredibly disturbed by that event, and especially all of the social unrest and the toxic nature of anything and everything political that followed that. Furthermore, my employment as a school bus driver, that was up in the air. So I was worried about being able to provide for my family. And to top it all off, I had been doing so great early on in the year that I had weaned off my antidepressant meds. So you put all those factors together, and I had a perfect storm of the soul. The severe depression this time hit me like a tidal wave. It hit me so hard that just by the end of June, I was having suicidal thoughts. Out of desperation, I checked myself into a residential depression treatment program in the Seattle area the first week of July of that year at a cost of about $1,000 a day. I went there to try to arrest the depression from getting any worse, but I was already spiraling down too rapidly. And except for one very encouraging conversation that I had with someone at that depression treatment center, who's become a dear friend to me, my first 3 days of treatment were a disaster. I felt guilty about how much money it was costing. I couldn't sleep at all while I was there. After three days of treatment, they gave us 2 days. Usually they just give 1 day off on the weekend, Sunday, because they know how important it is for you to stay on a very strict schedule as you're recovering from depression. But it was July 4th, so they gave us 2 days off. And those were the worst 2 days of my entire life. After not being able to sleep now for 4 days, my body and my brain went into a panic attack, very acute panic attack that lasted for 20 hours with no relent. And in the early morning hours, this is about, I'm like 12 hours into this panic attack. In the early morning hours of Sunday, July 5th, 2020, I settled on a plan to take my life because I could not live for one more minute with such severe symptoms. I even wrote a note for my family. I wanted them to know they weren't to blame at all. But just the depression was just too much for me to bear this time. Fortunately, after I realized I was too scared to go through with it, I called my wife, and she made the hour-long drive to come get me and bring me home. And the panic attack still lasted for a while, but after a few hours, it finally subsided. But it was replaced by a profound apathy and very little desire to live. So a couple days later, I checked myself into a hospital in the Tacoma area. I stayed there for a week. They got me back on meds, and I started to sleep again. This is in the middle of July 2020. And for the next 5 weeks, I battled very severe depression. It was near impossible to get out of bed. I experienced thoughts that I'd just be better off dead. It just took everything to do just basic, get out of bed and dress myself kind of things. Also, my relationship with my youngest daughter was still strained and getting worse. And she was also really struggling with her mental health. You see, depression runs in my family. My mom, my grandma, my brother, we've all suffered from acute depression. And I've had the most severe case of them all. What turned things around for me was in late August of 2020, I landed a job working for Amazon deliveries. It's just kind of neat how God put that together. It was unexpected. It kind of got put in my lap, and it was very encouraging. And then the same day, I found out that I still had my school bus driving job for the upcoming year. We were all in limbo. Are we going to have any job or not for next school year? We were all in limbo until late August. We all found out that they were going to keep us on the payroll. I had also been pouring into my recovery. I was taking my meds. I was seeing my doctor. I was still leading worship a little bit on Zoom for the Celebrate Recovery. You see, for me, depression recovery has this long delayed effect. I have to choose to do all the right things. Often I have to choose to do the right things for many weeks, even months, before there's any lift in the depression at all. It's like this, I have to pour into it and invest, invest, and I see no improvement. There's this delay time, this lag time. But so although that's really frustrating in a way, it's also really helped me rely more on Jesus. To have the faith that things will, even though I don't feel it right now, things will improve, even though recovery might feel impossible in this moment. So praise God, my depression has been in full remission now for over 2 years. I'm doing great today. Although I'll never have any guarantee that it won't happen again, I'm more dedicated than ever, now than ever, to doing what I can to prevent a relapse. Attending recovery groups and keeping my body, mind, and soul healthy are keys for me. Sharing my testimony like I'm doing tonight, that's key. That's huge for me. Leading worship for people, that is huge for me. It really helps my mental health. Drawing close to God in the mornings with scripture, and I do a lot of journaling. It's just how I connect to God. Everyone's different this way, but for me, kind of writing my prayers and kind of journaling, kind of examining my day with God and kind of talking about it through writing on how it's going is also a big help. And also keeping life in better balance is something I'm finally learning to do, and that's been a big help. I'm finally very, very excited about my future that God has for me and my family. Lord willing, I'll be able to be more and more of an advocate for people struggling with their mental health. And I've learned that there's no shame in having a mental illness. In fact, it can be a great, great way to help other people. For so many people, mental illness and chemical addiction go hand in hand. That is so true for me, and I know it so intimately. So I know God can use me to really become his son of light, like he called me into so clearly 12 years ago. God's given me a new vision for my life, to be used by him right at the intersection of mental health, my faith, worship, and now long distance running. That's right, long distance running. So this past summer, I ran a 50-kilometer, that's 32 miles. I ran a 50-kilometer race that went all the way around Mount St. Helens on this really rugged trail. And I did it to raise money for disaster relief in Ukraine. Found a ministry that they're bringing humanitarian aid and bringing the gospel to Ukrainians who have fled the country and are just, their lives are in shambles. And I was able to raise $2,100 by doing that. Well, it took me 10 and a half hours to run around Mount St. Helens. It was pretty grueling, but with God's help, I made it. Amen. On November 5th, so coming up in just a few weeks, right? I'll be running another 50K race. And this time, I'm raising money for Absolute Ministry. Raising money for Absolute Ministry. I knew if I could get my body into marathon running shape again, I promised God I would run for a cause, not just run for my own selfish, because I do love running. That might sound insane to you, like who would enjoy running that far? I really enjoy it, getting out on those trails and seeing what my body can do. It's pretty amazing. But I promised God if I could get back in shape, I lost like 30 pounds last winter to start training for the summer, that I'd run with a cause. And so I went global by doing the Ukraine thing. I got back from that, I'm like, God is calling me to do something really local, something right here in Auburn. What could be going on here in Auburn? What might be a place I could even potentially serve and get to know some great people. And God put Absolute Ministry in my heart. So on November 5th, I'm going to run that. I'm challenging 50 people to each donate $1 per kilometer. And that would, if I find that, if that happens, that would be a total of $2,500. That's the goal. And so please pray for me and with this endeavor, and pray that people will see the vision. And I believe in God and his power to change lives. He sure has changed mine. He will change yours. I believe in what this ministry is doing. I really believe in it. And I believe in you guys. And I'm saying that not to put pressure on you, not at all. I'm saying it because it's heartfelt. I believe, you're doing this for a reason. And, God's got this. I believe in you guys. And so, thanks for letting me share tonight. I just wanted to say, lastly, when Kristen brought me home on July 5th, 2020, after my suicide attempt, the most awful day of my life, I told her something when the 20-hour panic attack finally finished. I told her that if I wrote a book someday, it would be titled, "You're Never Too Far Gone." So if you would pray about that as well, because I'm actually thinking about that more and more, like actually writing that book. So if I could just give one person just a little more hope, then all of these challenges will be totally worth it. So, thanks for letting me share.